Mullet Mad Jack, Cyberpunk Pastiche, and Contemporary First-Person Shooters. Introduction. Mullet Mad Jack is a fast-paced retro FPS released in May 2024. It styles itself after a cyberpunk anime OVA from the 90s with its UI, set design, and characters drenched in maximalist retro-futuristic greebling. It takes you through a series of linearly constructed levels, each barely a minute long, with roguelike style upgrades at the end. Its twist is in its health system. You are constantly on a 10-second timer counting down to death, which must be replenished by killing enemies in novel and exciting ways. In setting about defining this game as cyberpunk, we're going to look at some quotes from various writings on the genre, and a lot of them have to do with consumerism and the concept of the hip. So one writing is from Kamroska, who states that the invention of cyberpunk literature relies heavily on its original attitude towards technology. For the first time, high-tech devices were described not in terms of saving the human race, but changing the shape of social structures as well as individual human being. Mullet Mad Jack's central gameplay premise is contextualized through the idea that the protagonist's journey, with all its dangers and thrills, is constantly streamed to a live audience whose approval he depends on to live. It would be difficult to come up with a less subtle metaphor for the exploitation of parasocial relationships and the commodification of human connection. Another foundational writing on cyberpunk is Rone's Cyberpunk and Neuromanticism, which is written in response to other writings. It's hard to see the integrated political aesthetic motives of alienated subcultures that adopt the high-tech tools of the establishment they are supposedly alienated from. It seems far more reasonable to assume that the integrating, such as it is being done by the dominant telectronic cultural powers who, as cyberpunk writers know very well, are insatiable in their appetite for new commodities and commodity fashions. All the technological power available to the player and felt through gameplay is delivered through the market forces of Peace Corp. The game's roguelike structure has us choosing new weapons, abilities, and passive upgrades sold to us by the same company who chains us to our 10-second life bar. A continuation of Rene's point, judging from even the best of writers in Sterling's anthology, for cyberpunk's hipness is all. The all-consuming power of the hip is felt in the world of Mullet Mad Jack, where style is king. Beyond the desire to save a damsel in distress, the protagonist is seduced by the promise of a fresh pair of sneakers, emblazoned with the word consume. His desire for rebellion and earnest human connection through romance is subsumed under the prospect of more of these products. The game's true ending has him abandoning his partner to slave away in the game's endless mode, unlocking sneakers for each milestone hit. Another part of the cyberpunk genre is Japan as a utopian ideal. This is the Japan that represents hypermodernism in all its dimensions. During the 1980s, it seemed that Japanese society, with its superb bureaucracy, efficiently functioning government, and technological expertise, existed as a utopian alternative to the societies of the West. The high-tech of the cyberpunk aesthetic is inextricably linked to the context of Japan being perceived as a rising technological superpower of the 80s. Mullet Mad Jack takes after this in its city pop aesthetic, being drenched in neon lighting and fetishized versions of traditional Japanese iconography. Moreover, its characters are illustrated in a style of anatomy and rendering reminiscent of anime OVAs from the era. All ghost, no shell. The above is a coy reference the game makes to a foundational anime cyberpunk classic, Ghost in the Shell, in the form of a quippy one-liner from the main character. One analysis of just for context of the Ghost in the Shell film comes from Komroska, who says the cyborgs, hybrids of artificial bodies and human cells, have become the next stage of evolution. Ghost in the Shell presents the merging of human and robot identities as a natural eventuality of the way technology progresses. It centers around its main character struggling to reconcile her human self with her all-mechanical body, a dilemma which she resolves by fusing with an AI in a digital realm, finding solace in a dual identity. Curiously, Mullet Mad Jack doesn't lift as much thematically from foundational anime cyberpunk thought as it does aesthetically. It explicitly resists the concept of transhumanism, creating a dichotomy between the human protagonist and the hordes of robot enemies he tears through. Cyberpunk and gender. It's a quote from Kadora's Feminist Cyberpunk. Until very recently, cyberpunk has been a predominantly masculinist project with few strong female characters. Often characterized by a nostalgia for an organic, pastoral past, feminist sci-fi remains largely untouched by cyberpunk's enthusiasm for technology. Feminist cyberpunk envisions something that feminist theory badly needs: multiply positioned subjects who can negotiate and succeed in a high-tech, postmodern world. In order to compare how the game lives up to this, we're going to conduct an analysis of several of the characters. The protagonist, Mullet Mad Jack, is kind of a paper-thin, hyper-masculine parody of a Duke Nukem-style character. The dialogue can be customized through the in-game perk system to sort of adapt him to different masculine archetypes, like being more silent or using more quippy one-liners, which implies he doesn't actually have much material characterization and instead is just kind of a mouthpiece for whatever the player would like. It's also worth mentioning that the violence and aggression in his masculinity is implicitly supported by the first person perspective and the fact that you're always positioned to agree with what he's doing and feel his rage. In contrast, the main female character, the influencer princess, is sort of positioned as a damsel in distress from you, and she's featured almost exclusively as an object. She's used to mark possession points and the vending machines you use to heal in game. She's literally presented as a consumable product. A character who sort of breaks this dichotomy is the streamer, who makes like snarky comments in between moments of gameplay and acts as a mouthpiece for the game's corporate villains. She sort of transitions from a state of low threat to being a villain in the game's secret ending, where she kidnaps you and forces you to engage with the endless mode. It would seem that she's engaging a little bit more with the tech of the situation she's in and is more engaged with the plot at large, but ultimately she's still kind of shallow and doesn't get to have much control over the story. It seems that Mullet Mad Jack, in its eagerness for nostalgia, would rather harken back to gendered stereotypes from the 80s than acknowledge or support the feminist progression of the genre as outlined by Kadora. It would be remiss not to analyze Mullet Mad Jack in regards to its mechanics. So mechanically it aligns itself with contemporary indie FPS design trains favoring speed and takes them a step further. Similarly to other retro shooters like Dusk and Ultrakill, it takes after Quake with its focus on high mobility, quick reaction times, and the sort of head-on-a-swivel style of gameplay. Mullet Mad Jack sharpens this into a laser focus with incredibly linear level designs, each barely a minute long, numerically making both the player and enemy's glass cannons, creating an all-risk, all-reward atmosphere. This is not to mention its extreme twist on an arcade scoring system. While a game like Ultrakill rewards its players with style points for making interesting decisions in combat, Mullet Mad Jack makes it necessary for survival. It seems eager to eke out its contemporaries in just how short-term its thrills can get. The aesthetic link to the frantic healing system to an in-universe livestream means the game could be read as a critique of dopamine-chasing trends in game design and social media, interpreting cyberpunk themes in a novel context. While certainly slicker in art style than the low-poly grunge of a game like Dusk, Mullet Mad Jack is in conversation with the retro shooter trend and, by extension, the history of the FPS genre as a whole. Terrian's anthropological analysis of the first-person shooter genre is relevant here. The birth of the FPS scenario carries exacerbated technological violence and commercial success as implicit selection criteria, and consequently takes part in a widespread culture of techno-industrial glorification. If such criteria are to be put forward in historical constructions, they should at the very least be acknowledged more clearly. Terrian warns against the over-focus on violence and technological excellence in the historical definition of the FPS genre. While Mullet Mad Jack and its contemporaries conform to the former, their embracing of retro graphics can be said to give them a powerfully subversive role in regards to the latter. For instance, Mullet Mad Jack's flat, sprite-based textures are certainly a far cry from AAA industry standard graphics. In conclusion, there is no questioning the fact that Mullet Mad Jack revels in evoking the cyberpunk aesthetic of the past, cramming as many signifiers of its glossy yet retro vision of the 80s into the mechanical framework of a modern movement shooter as it can. What remains to be considered is how sincerely it engages with cyberpunk philosophy. On the one hand, Mullet Mad Jack could be read as being opposed to AAA game design convention in several ways. Besides being a budgetary consideration, its flat, sprite-based textures resist the trend of chasing high-fidelity graphics and contributes to the conversation started by its retro shooter peers, leveraging the indie market to resist the culture of techno-industrial glorification Terrian warns us of. It can also be read as a satire of dopamine-chasing trends in modern game and social media design. Another quote to bring up in relation to this is Dolan's construct of hauntology, which he positions as sort of opposite to nostalgia. Hauntology is progressive and nostalgia is regressive. There is nothing bad or inherently nefarious in nostalgia, yet when over-relied on by capitalist ventures, especially in marketing, nostalgia becomes a tool that recycles the past for profit and can help solidify the status quo. On the other hand, however, Mullet Mad Jack seems disinterested in rejecting the regressive holdovers of classic cyberpunk. In being so eager to represent the gender roles and Japanese fetishism of the 80s, it uncritically recreates the problematic norms of the time in what could be read as little more than a marketing tactic. If this is to be believed, Mullet Mad Jack falls victim to the very spectre the cyberpunk genre warns us against, that of consumerism and the absorption of seemingly countercultural ideas into the capitalist markets they set out to rebel against. Another final relevant quote from Rune is that the big question for 80s art is whether any authentic countercultural art can exist for long without being transformed into self-annihilating simulations of themselves for mass consumption, furthering central cultural aims. Here is the bibliography, and that concludes the presentation. Thank you for watching.